The last honest report I ever filed was for a lithium concession on Murata 6. Clean numbers, clean conscience. 14 days later, a supply algorithm reclassified the colony as non-viable, and 41,000 people lost their freight allotment. Most of them starved inside a year. I wrote the truth, and the machine did what machines do with truth. It optimized. That was 3 assessments ago. I still file clean reports. I just think harder about what clean means. CERN looked exactly the way a troubled concession world is supposed to look from orbit. The planet sat fat and dark against its dim star, tidally locked. One hemisphere frozen solid, and the other smeared with magma glow along the horizon. The colony clung to the narrow twilight band between the two, the only strip where the temperature allowed exposed infrastructure without catastrophic maintenance costs. My shuttle punched through the thin atmosphere and the whole descent was turbulence, the kind that comes from uneven heating across a world that can't decide if it's an icebox or a furnace. The docking clamps caught us on the spine's upper platform. The spine was the colony's backbone, a line of connected habitat modules and processing plants half buried in cooled lava flows running roughly north to south along the terminator. From above, it looked like a surgical scar. The steward was already waiting when I unsealed the hatch. Florence Osei, concession steward, the Empire's local face on CERN. She had the particular bearing of someone who has rehearsed a welcome speech and is determined to deliver it before anything unscripted happens. 2 staffers flanked her, holding equipment manifests and wearing the stiff expressions of people instructed to look competent. Assessor Rupert, welcome to CERN. We've prepared a full briefing package and assigned you quarters in the administrative wing. I'll take the quarters. Skip the briefing. I shouldered my kit and stepped past her onto the platform. The air bit immediately. Thin, dry, and cold enough to sting exposed skin. Fine basalt grit skittered across the deck plating and collected in every seam, every hinge, every joint. It covered everything in a fine dark powder that my boots left tracks in. I want to start the physical inspection now. She adjusted faster than most stewards do. The rehearsed warmth dropped and something more practical replaced it. Of course, if you'll follow me, I can walk you through the primary facilities. We entered the spine's main corridor, and within 30 meters, I had my first 3 observations. A bulkhead door with shot pressure seals, the rubber gasket visibly cracked, the status light wired to show green regardless. I could see where someone had bypassed the sensor with a jumper cable and taped over it. A filtration unit coughing fine basalt dust back into the corridor it was supposed to be cleaning. Its intake grill caked to the point where the fan labored audibly. And cabling. Runs of it overhead, patched with tape and junction splices, 3 or 4 generations of repair laid on top of each other. You could read the colony's budget history in those cables, each layer a little more improvised than the last. The floor plating was worn to bare metal in the center of the walkway and still coated at the edges, a path beaten by thousands of boots going the same direction twice a day. Shift in and shift out. The overhead lights were industrial strips, half of them running at reduced output, casting the corridor in uneven bands of brightness and shade. A good corridor tells you everything about a concession. This one told me the money ran out about 4 years ago and nobody sent more. Florence talked the whole time. Production tonnage, shift rotations, quarterly maintenance summaries. She delivered numbers at a pace designed to fill silence and prevent questions, and she steered us clockwise down the corridor. The processing plant was counterclockwise. I'd reviewed the facility schematic on descent and knew the layout. I let her lead. What a steward hides is always more useful than what they show. The quarters she gave me were small but functional. A bunk, a fold-down desk, a terminal alcove with a hardline connection to the colony's local network, and a relay uplink to my ship in orbit. Everything was coated in a barely visible film of basalt grit, including the inside of the pillowcase. I ran my thumb along the desk surface and left a clean track. The terminal screen showed a default welcome page. Colony population, current shift schedule, emergency procedures. I skimmed it. 17,412 registered residents. 81% classified as extraction workforce or dependents. Median debt-to-earnings ratio of 4.2 to 1, which meant most of them owed more to the concession than they'd earned in their entire time on CERN. Standard debt colony arithmetic. The kind of numbers that make a place feel less like a settlement and more like an open-air labor camp that happens to have a school and a medical bay. I dropped my kit on the bunk. Didn't sit. The primary facilities, now please. The processing floor was a long, low-ceilinged space where raw ore was crushed, graded, and packed into shipping crates. Conveyors rattled along overhead tracks, dropping loads into sorting hoppers that shook on worn bearings. Dust hung in the work lights and gave the air a granular quality, like looking through dirty glass. The floor was basalt slab, cracked in places where heavy machinery had been bolted down and then moved, leaving behind anchor holes that no one had filled. I picked up a raw sample from the grading belt, a chunk of dark stone, dense, glassy, heavier than it looked. Pale threads ran through it like veins in a wrist, catching the light at odd angles. I turned it in my hands. The threads weren't uniform. They branched, forked, reconnected. Patterns that looked less like mineral striations and more like something that had grown. I set it back on the belt. 2 shift supervisors gave me the same careful recitation Florence had clearly coached them on. Quota numbers, equipment status, workforce morale rated on a 5-point scale that nobody uses, honestly. One of them, a heavy-set man named Torin, had been on CERN for 9 years, long enough that the basalt dust had worked its way into the creases around his eyes and the lines of his palms, giving him a permanently weathered look. He told me about a coolant manifold that had been leaking for 3 weeks, delivering it almost as an aside, the way you mention a household chore you keep putting off. Then he laughed about his daughter, who was learning to read from a cargo manifest because the colony school only ran 3 days a week, and she'd exhausted the other materials. She's got the shipping codes memorized before the words, he told me. Asks me what friable aggregate means at dinner. He had a broad, tired face and the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has decided that if you can't fix something, you might as well find it funny. I logged the manifold leak and moved on. The quota shortfall was running at 18%. Bad, but within the range where a concession could survive if the next quarter improved. Nothing in the numbers, taken alone, would require drastic action. I want to see the pits. Florence nodded, unsurprised. Pit 3 is the most active. We can take the cage lift. Pit 3 was a vertical shaft bored straight down into the basalt, about 8 meters across. The cage lift was a steel-framed platform suspended on cables that ran through a central track, with a separate ore lift on a parallel rail. The cage had been repainted at least 3 times. I could see the layers peeling at the corners, each a slightly different shade of industrial yellow. We descended. The temperature dropped steadily, and the walls changed as we went deeper, smoother, darker, the basalt transitioning from rough-hewn to something that looked almost polished, as if the deeper rock had a different grain entirely. The pale filaments I'd seen in the ore sample grew thicker down here. They wove through the walls in branching patterns, dense and vascular, and the cage light caught them as we passed. They gave back a faint luminance, something between reflection and actual glow, that persisted for a beat after the light moved on. I watched them scroll past through the cage bars. They followed no straight line. They curved, split, and rejoined, and at the thickest points they looked less like mineral veins and more like a circulatory system frozen mid-flow. At one depth, maybe 200 meters down, a cluster of them converged into a node the size of my fist, and the glow there was stronger, steadier, with a warmth that had no business being in cold stone. The descent took nearly 4 minutes. Neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the cable mechanism above us and the faint tick of the cage frame flexing under its own weight. The pit floor was a working face about 15 meters across. A cutting team was operating there, 4 miners in heavy exosuits using thermal lances to free ore slabs from the walls. The noise was enormous, a sustained, sharp cracking that bounced around the shaft and turned speech into something you had to shout or wait out. One of the miners broke from the face and walked toward us. Young, wiry, visor up, sweat cutting clean tracks through the basalt dust on their face. I checked the work roster on my handheld. Harry Rudd. Standard questions first. Shift length, equipment condition, rest cycle compliance. Harry answered with the flat, blunt honesty of someone too tired for performance. 12 on, 12 off. Supposed to be. Usually runs 14 before relief shows. A shrug. Lances need new focusing elements. We've been running refurbed ones past their service hours. They drift. Drift how? Cut goes wide, you end up chasing the vein instead of following it. Takes longer, wastes charge, and when you chase a vein, you end up cutting into sections you didn't plan to open. Harry wiped dust from the visor with the back of the discolored hand, a casual gesture. Some of those veins, the deep ones with the heavy thread work, they don't cut clean. The rock tightens around the lance head, binds it. You have to back out and re-angle, and by then you've lost 20 minutes and the whole face has shifted a few millimeters. Too small to see, big enough to feel through the suit boots. The rock shifts. After a bad cut, sometimes not at all. But when it does, it's directional, like it's pulling away from the wound. I made a note. Then Harry reached up to push the visor back farther, and I got a clear look at their left hand and forearm. A mottled grey-black discoloration ran from the wrist almost to the elbow. The skin texture was wrong, too smooth, too dense, with a faint mineral hardness to it, as if the outer layer had been gradually replaced by a thin shell of something closer to stone than tissue. At the edges, where normal skin met the discoloration, the transition was not sharp. It feathered out in tiny branching lines. "What's that?" Harry glanced down at it with the disinterest of someone who has already had this conversation too many times. "Pit rash. Everyone who works the deep faces gets it eventually." I looked at Florence. She met my eyes with a steadiness that told me the answer was prepared. She gave me a clinical-sounding name for the condition, something about trace mineral absorption from prolonged deep face exposure, and told me it was cosmetic. Superficial hardening, nothing structural, happened to everyone who worked the deep faces long enough. I looked at Harry's forearm again. The discoloration didn't look superficial. It looked like the stone was eating inward. The branching lines at the edges matched the thread patterns in the pit walls. I let it go, made a note. But the note I made wasn't dermal condition, investigate. The note I made was skin condition matches or vein patterning, ask medical staff. Then I crossed out the second half and left just the first 4 words. Some things you don't put in writing until you know what category they belong to. Back on the cage lift, ascending, I pulled up the facility map on my handheld and tapped the southern sector. A restricted marker sat over a zone labeled Exclusion Zone, Geological Instability. "I want to see this." Florence's composure changed for the first time. Small, but I'd been reading stewards for 12 years and I caught it. Her shoulders straightened and her speech slowed by half a beat. "That area is restricted due to ground instability. We've had subsidence events. It's not safe for a walking inspection. My audit authority covers all facility areas, restricted or otherwise, Section 9 of the concession charter." I didn't look up from the map. "If access is obstructed, I can request a military escort from the orbital relay. That usually takes about 72 hours, and it generates a separate incident report." She didn't answer right away. The cage reached the surface and the gate clanged open. She stood there, one hand on the gate rail, looking at me the way someone looks at a piece of equipment that just started making a new sound. "I'll get you suits." The walk to the exclusion zone took us outside the spine. Partial pressure suits over our clothes. Not full environment rigs, just enough to handle the thin air and the cold. Florence and I, no staffers. She hadn't invited them and I hadn't asked. The exterior path ran along the colony's southern edge, a track of compressed basalt gravel with guide lights at knee height. To our left, the spine's modules, half buried and angular. To our right, open ground stretched toward the frozen hemisphere, a vast, dark plain under a sky the color of old iron. CERN's star sat permanently on the horizon, a swollen orange disk that never rose and never set. The light it threw was flat and directionless. It killed shadows and made distances hard to judge. A ridge half a kilometer out could have been a boulder 50 meters away. The ground was the same dark basalt as everything else, fine-grained and lightly scarred by wind. We walked for 20 minutes in silence. The only sound was our boots on the gravel and the faint whine of the suit's air assist. Florence stayed a full pace behind me, which could have been deference or reluctance or both. The guide lights ended at a barrier, a simple rail with hazard markers, nothing structural, just a line someone had drawn. The markers were old, their paint worn to bare metal at the edges by the constant basalt grit. Beyond the rail, the ground was different. Cracked, buckled upward in places, split by old fissures that ran at irregular angles like something underneath had shifted, and the surface couldn't hold. Some of the fissures had a faint discoloration along their edges, the same dark grey to black gradient I'd seen on Harry's forearm. And the pillars. I saw them from maybe 100 meters out, dark vertical forms rising from the broken ground, scattered across an area the size of a freight yard. Some barely taller than a person, others reaching 4 or 5 meters. At first, they could have been natural. Basalt columns, volcanic remnants, some geological feature I'd need a specialist to name. They had a rough symmetry that could pass for crystalline formation if you didn't look too closely. I looked too closely. Then I got closer. The nearest pillar was about 2 meters tall and roughly cylindrical, its surface glassy and striated with fine parallel lines, like growth rings in wood or layers of sediment compressed into stone. I walked up to it and put my hand against the surface. A vibration came through the glove. Buried inside it, my suit translated the vibration into a sound, a human voice compressed into a single broken syllable, repeating. The noise carried the shape of a word without resolving into one, like a recording slowed past recognition and then sped back up wrong. I pulled my hand back. Florence stood 10 meters behind me, arms at her sides. She hadn't followed me in. The second pillar was taller. This one had visible textures beneath the glassy surface, shapes embedded in the stone, half resolved, as if the rock had been liquid once and solidified around whatever it caught. Near the base, about waist height, I found a hand. Human. The fingers were splayed wide, pressing outward from inside. The detail was perfect, knuckle creases, the ragged edge of a torn fingernail, a wedding band compressed into the stone around the ring finger. The stone around it had the same glassy, striated quality, and the transition between flesh and rock was seamless. The skin flowed into stone at a level finer than my eye could resolve. The sound from this pillar was different, higher, broken into fragments. A syllable, maybe a name, repeating every few seconds. I moved through the field. There were dozens of them. Some had no visible human features. Others had too many. One pillar about 3 meters out had a face near its apex, eyes open, mouth closed. The expression caught somewhere between surprise and a gasp. The whole face was sinking into the surrounding stone, as if the mineral was slowly digesting it. The surface around the face shifted in barely visible increments, a quality of motion so slow and so slight that you could almost convince yourself you were imagining it. I walked back to where Florence was standing. How many? 7 unaccounted for. She used the phrase the way you use a word you've practiced until it loses its meaning. The first formations appeared 18 months ago, after we opened the deep southern veins. 7 people. 7 people who were working near active extraction phases during what we classified as subsidence events. The ground opened. The veins reacted. By the time recovery teams reached the sites, the formations had already solidified. She paused. The fastest one took about 40 seconds. The slowest took 3 minutes. We have suit cam footage of the slowest. I would not recommend watching it. You classified this as geological instability. What would you have classified it as, Assessor? I didn't answer. I looked back at the field. The pillars stood in the flat, shadowless light of CERN's locked horizon, dark and vertical and absolute. Through my suit's audio pickups, I could hear the sounds from enough of them to matter. Voice fragments, broken syllables, the compressed residue of people who had been caught by the rock they were cutting and folded into it, and some part of whatever they had been in that last moment was still cycling, still repeating, pressed into the stone like a thumbprint in wet clay that had since hardened and kept the impression perfectly. My assessment categories couldn't touch this. None of them described a mind that took people into itself and kept their voices. The category I chose would determine what happened next. Whether these people's families kept living in the spine above us, or whether a fleet showed up to burn everything clean. Florence was watching me the way you watch a man holding a detonator he hasn't decided to press. I turned away from the obelisk field and started walking back toward the spine. I didn't go back to my quarters. I went to the admin module. The admin module was a squat annex bolted onto the spine's midsection. 3 rooms and a shared corridor. Florence's office, a records room, and a small conference space with a table that doubled as a workbench. Someone had left soldering tools at one end. The records room had a terminal with access to the colony's local filing system, production logs, incident reports, personnel rosters, medical intake forms. Everything a steward was required to maintain for imperial audit. I sat down and started reading, looking for the lie instead of the data. The shape of a lie tells you what someone is afraid of. Florence's production logs were clean. Too clean. Quarterly tonnage tracked against projections with the kind of smooth consistency that only happens in spreadsheets, never in mines. I cross-referenced the daily extraction reports against the quarterly summaries and found the padding, small tonnage additions distributed across dozens of shifts. Never enough to look suspicious on any single entry, but collectively adding up to about 6% of reported output. She'd been inflating the numbers just enough to keep the shortfall inside acceptable range. That was expected. Every steward does it. What interested me was the personnel file. 7 miners listed as transferred inter-concession rotation, standard language for workers moving between sites. Except CERN had no inter-concession agreements with any neighboring world. I'd checked the charter on descent. Transfers required a receiving concession to file acceptance paperwork, and none existed. Florence had logged 7 people as transferred to places that hadn't agreed to take them, and no one in the Imperial filing system had flagged the discrepancy because the algorithm that checked workforce numbers only looked at headcounts, not destinations. 7 names. 7 obelisks. I closed the terminal, walked down the corridor, and pushed open Florence's office door without knocking. She was sitting behind her desk with a cup of something lukewarm and a stack of requisition forms. She looked at me, set the cup down, and waited. The transfer records are fabricated. Yes. You logged 7 dead miners as alive and relocated. If I logged them as dead, I'd need cause of death. If the cause of death is consumed by the rock they were mining, that flags a xenological incident review. If it flags a review, a team comes here. If a team comes here, they find the obelisks. She folded her hands on the desk. And then what happens, Assessor? That depends on what they classify the obelisks as. No, it depends on what you classify them as. You're here now. The team never has to come. We looked at each other across the desk. The requisition forms between us had coffee rings on them, and the slightly wrinkled look of paper that's been handled too many times. Behind her, through a narrow window, I could see a strip of the exterior path and the flat orange light of CERN's permanent horizon. Tell me about the extraction pattern. Florence leaned back. The southern veins are the highest grade ore on the planet. Maybe 80% of our export value comes from those shafts. 18 months ago, when we pushed the southern faces deeper and opened 3 new cutting fronts in rapid sequence, the ground started reacting. First it was small. Tremors, shifts in the rock face, veins that seemed to tighten when we cut them. Then the first miner went into the stone. And you kept extracting. I throttled the southern shafts, cut the crew rotation, slowed the pace, pulled back from the deepest faces. Production dropped. That's your 18% shortfall. But the incidents stopped, mostly. As long as we stay below a certain rate of extraction in those veins, the ground stays quiet. What rate? I don't have a number. I have a feel. Too many cuts too fast in the deep threadwork and the ground gets tense. The miners can sense it, some of them. The good ones pull back before it goes wrong. The ones who push through. She didn't finish. So you've been walking a line. Extract enough to stay above the viability threshold. Hold back before the rock reacts. And still not meet quota, which is why you're here. She was right. The Imperial planning algorithm had flagged CERN for assessment specifically because the shortfall crossed the review trigger at 16%. Florence had kept the colony alive by underproducing, and underproducing had brought me here. And my arrival meant someone was going to make a decision about CERN's future, based on categories that couldn't accommodate what was actually happening. Why not seal the southern shafts entirely? Mine the northern and eastern veins. Take the production hit. Because without the southern ore, our total output drops below 40% of quota. At 40%, the algorithm doesn't flag us for review. It flags us for termination. Supply contracts cancelled, freight allotments revoked, the concession classified as non-viable. She picked up her cup again, looked at it, put it back down. You know what that means. 17,000 people with no food shipments and no way off-world. I knew what it meant. I'd seen it happen on Murata 6, the slow starvation of a colony that the Empire had decided wasn't worth feeding. So seal the shafts and request a reclassification, emergency variants. I filed 3 variance requests in the first year. 2 were denied by automated review. The third was approved in principle and routed to a resource allocation board that meets twice a year. That was 11 months ago. I haven't received a response. She met my eyes. The system doesn't have a setting for our mine is alive and eating people. It has settings for productive and non-viable. I chose productive. I chose it every day for 18 months, and 7 people are dead because of it, and the other 17,000 are alive because of it. If you have a better option, Assessor, I'd like to hear it. I didn't have a better option. I had a blank audit report and 46 categories, and none of them described what was happening on CERN. Florence had spent 18 months building a fragile equilibrium out of faked records and throttled extraction, keeping the colony alive by lying upward and rationing downward. And the whole structure depended on nobody from the Imperial core looking too closely. I was the person looking too closely. I left her office and went to find Harry Rudd. The shift rotation board in the spine's main corridor listed Harry on a rest cycle, quartered in the miners' hab block on the lower level. I found them in the common area, a wide, low room with bolted-down benches and a meal dispensary that looked like it served 3 options on good days and 1 on bad ones. Harry was sitting alone, eating something grey-brown from a tray, left arm resting on the table. The discoloration had spread since I'd last seen them in Pit 3. It now covered the forearm completely and extended past the elbow, creeping up toward the shoulder. The texture had changed too. Where earlier it had looked like a hardening of the skin, Now it looked like the skin was being replaced, the surface smoother, denser, with a faint gloss that caught the overhead light the same way the pit walls did. Harry saw me looking and pulled the sleeve down, out of habit more than embarrassment. The way you cover a wound you're tired of explaining. I need you to take me to the southern shafts, the ones Florence throttled. Harry chewed, considered. Why? Because I need to see what she's keeping the extraction rate below. I need to understand what's down there. You won't understand it. Nobody does. Then I need to not understand it in person, with my own eyes instead of not understanding it from a report. Something close to a smile. Harry pushed the tray aside and stood up, moving stiffly on the left side. Fine. But we go slow, and if I tell you we leave, we leave. No audit authority overrides on this one. Agreed. The southern shaft was deeper than Pit 3 and narrower, barely 6 meters across, with older infrastructure. The cage lift here was a different model, smaller, the cables thicker, and the frame heavier. Harry told me it was the original equipment from when the colony was founded, never replaced. The walls of the shaft showed the marks of early boring, rougher cuts, less precision, the work of a crew that had been in a hurry to reach ore and didn't care about clean lines. The descent was slower. Harry stood with their weight shifted to the right side, favoring the left arm, which hung at a slightly wrong angle. Not injured, but stiffened, as if the joint were losing its range of motion by degrees. I could see the discoloration at the collar of their shirt, a dark margin just above the fabric line. Earlier it had stopped at the elbow. The filaments in the walls were different down here. Thicker, some as wide as my finger, and packed so densely that the rock between them was almost secondary. The stone had become a frame for the threadwork rather than the other way around. And the faint luminance I'd seen in Pit 3 was stronger here, a steady warmth in the walls that made the shaft feel less like a hole in the ground and more like the inside of something. How deep does it go? I asked, watching the lit walls scroll past. Deeper than we've bored. The survey soundings show dense threadwork continuing for at least another 2 kilometers below our lowest face. Could be more. The soundings get unreliable past that depth. The signal comes back wrong. Scattered, like there's nothing solid to bounce off. Harry flexed the fingers of the discolored hand, testing what still worked. Florence stopped the deep survey program after the first incident. No point mapping territory you can't mine. We reached a platform about 300 meters down, where the shaft widened into a junction. 3 lateral tunnels branched off at different angles, each one dark, each one sealed with heavy grating and warning markers. Florence's throttle. The faces behind those gratings hadn't been worked in months. Harry walked to the nearest grating and pressed a bare hand, the discolored one, flat against the stone beside it. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then Harry's breathing changed. Slower, deeper, and their eyes lost focus, not closing but going somewhere else, the gaze fixed on a middle distance that wasn't in the tunnel. I waited. The walls around us had that quality I'd seen in the obelisk field, a sense of held tension, of stone that was mid-process, caught between states. The threadwork in the walls was not glowing now. It was dark, dense, packed tight, and it had a quality of weight to it. Not physical weight, but presence, the way a room feels different when someone is standing behind you and you haven't turned around yet. Harry pulled the hand back, flexed the fingers. The motion was stiff, the joints moving with visible resistance. Heavy. The word came out flat, without emphasis. Heavier than last week. The pressure is building. But it's not moving yet. We're still below whatever line it draws. What does heavy feel like? A long pause. Like standing under deep water, not drowning, just the weight of everything above you, pressing. And there's a direction to it, mostly down, from the deep veins, the ones we haven't reached yet. But sometimes it's lateral, from the south, like something pushing against the walls of this shaft from outside. Lateral. I don't know what it means. I'm telling you what it feels like. Maybe it's nerve damage. The medic thinks it's nerve damage. Harry looked at the discolored hand, turned it over, studied it as if checking someone else's work. Maybe it is. We rode the cage lift back up in silence. In my quarters, I opened the relay uplink to my ship and activated MINT, the adjutant interface, a semi-autonomous system embedded in my vessel's audit suite. Every assessor carried one. MINT handled document preparation, classification protocols, and cross-referencing with Imperial directives. It projected a small blue interaction field above the desk terminal and spoke in a neutral, precise register that I'd spent years finding useful and was now finding something else. I pulled the chair close and rested my hands on the desk, palms down. The surface still had that faint grit coating. Everything on this planet ended up coated. MINT, I need to test classification language for the CERN assessment. Start with uncharacterized xenological phenomenon as the primary finding. What does that trigger? A brief processing delay. Classification as uncharacterized xenological phenomenon routes the assessment to the Xenological Review Board, Imperial Bureau of Resource Standards. Current average processing time, 11 to 14 months. During the review period, the concession continues operations under existing parameters. No automatic enforcement action is triggered. Good. Now add confirmed workforce casualties to the finding. Adding confirmed workforce casualties to any xenological classification bypasses the review board and triggers automatic referral to the Sanitation Division under Standing Directive 77 Alpha. Sanitation Response Protocol includes site sterilization within a 50-kilometer radius of the reported phenomenon. There is no intermediate review stage. The directive is self-executing upon filing. I sat with that for a moment. Then I tried other language. Unknown geological agency resulting in structural failures and incidental workforce casualties. Unknown geological agency does not trigger xenological review. Structural failures routes to the Engineering Standards Board. Incidental workforce casualties attributed to structural failures are processed as industrial safety violations. Enforcement action, mandatory engineering audit within 90 days. No sanitation referral. So if the deaths are caused by a geological process, it's a safety violation. If the deaths are caused by something biological or unknown, it's a sterilization order. That is a simplified but accurate summary. The classification threshold is the word unknown, paired with any indicator of biological or lithic agency in the causation field. If the deaths can be attributed to a known catalogued cause, structural failure, equipment malfunction, environmental exposure, the report is processed through standard industrial channels. And if I can't attribute them to a known cause because the actual cause is a living organism that fuses people into stone pillars, then the causation field requires a designation from the xenological taxonomy. Any designation from that taxonomy paired with confirmed casualties triggers Standing Directive 77 Alpha. Every honest path through the classification system ended at the same place. The Empire had built a decision tree where the only two branches were known industrial hazard, manageable, and unknown agency with casualties, sterilize everything. There was no branch for something we don't understand that is killing people, but will kill more people if you send the fleet. The tree lacked that branch because the Empire didn't believe such a situation could exist. Unknown threats with casualties were, by definition, existential risks. Existential risks were, by definition, to be eliminated. The logic was clean. The logic was airtight. The logic would kill 17,000 people. MINT, is there any classification pathway that acknowledges an unknown cause of death without triggering sanitation referral? No. I leaned back in the chair. The blue interaction field floated above the desk, waiting for my next query. Through the thin wall of my quarters, I could hear the spine's background noise. ventilation cycling, the distant clatter of the processing floor running its night shift, someone walking past in the corridor. Ordinary sounds. 17,000 people going about the business of being alive in a place that the Empire would burn clean the moment I used the right words in the right field of the right form. The alarm hit the spine like a physical force, a deep, shuddering tone that travelled through the floor plating and the walls and the desk under my hands. Emergency klaxon. The kind that means something has gone wrong in the pits. I was on my feet and moving before the second pulse out the door of my quarters and into the main corridor where miners and admin staff were already running, all in the same direction, toward the pit access. Pit 3. The cage lift was cycling. Someone had already sent it down. I waited with a knot of emergency responders who were pulling on equipment, checking oxygen packs, shouting over the klaxon. The lift came back up empty and we piled in, 8 of us in a cage built for 6. The descent was fast this time, the cable operator overriding the speed governor. The pit floor was different from yesterday. The cutting face where Harry's team had been working was intact, but 20 meters deeper, where a lateral tunnel connected Pit 3 to the southern vein network, the rock had moved. The tunnel mouth had narrowed, compressed, as if the walls had contracted toward each other, and the floor had buckled upward in a ripple of cracked basalt. The threadwork in the walls was lit, glowing with the same faint warmth I'd seen in the deep southern shaft, but brighter, active, the luminance moving through the filaments in slow waves like blood through a vein. And at the junction, where the lateral tunnel met the main shaft, a new pillar stood. It was fresh. The surface was still warm. I could feel the heat from 2 meters away, a dry radiance like standing near a kiln. The glassy striations were still forming, the parallel lines tightening and settling as the stone contracted around whatever it held. It was smaller than the obelisks in the field, maybe 1.5 meters tall, and the shape was wrong, hunched, asymmetric, as if the person inside had been caught mid-crouch. The emergency team stopped at the edge of the changed ground and wouldn't go closer. I went closer. The face was visible. Near the top of the pillar, tilted slightly to one side, partially submerged in the glassy stone. The eyes were open. The mouth was open too, caught in the middle of a word or a shout. The expression not of pain exactly, but of profound surprise. The look of someone who has just understood something too large and too fast to react to. I knew the face. The basalt dust in the creases around the eyes, the broad, weathered features, the same palms that had gestured while he talked about his daughter. Torin. The pillar was making a sound, quieter than the older obelisks in the field, newer, not yet settled into its loop, but already repeating. A single word, broken at the edges, compressed and distorted, but recognizable. A name. Short, 2 syllables, spoken in the voice of a man who had laughed about cargo manifests and friable aggregate less than 20 hours ago. His daughter's name, over and over. The stone saying it with his mouth in a loop that would outlast everyone in the shaft. I stood there. The emergency team stood behind me. The walls of Pit 3 glowed in slow waves. There was no report I could write that would make this end well. The truth was a fleet. The lie was more of this. And somewhere in the hab blocks above us, a girl who could read shipping codes was waiting for her father to come home from his shift. The cage lift brought me back up from Pit 3 with the emergency team. No one spoke during the ascent. The cable mechanism ground overhead and the cage swayed in its track, and the walls scrolled past with their luminous threadwork dimming as we rose. The glow fading with depth, the filaments thinning, the stone becoming ordinary stone again, or what passed for ordinary on CERN. I could still hear Torin's voice in my head. Not the compressed loop from the obelisk, the real one, from yesterday, laughing about friable aggregate. The 2 sounds existed side by side, and neither would displace the other. At the surface, the team dispersed into the spine's corridors, Some of them moved with the quick, directed walk of people who had tasks to complete. Others stood in the junction near the pit access and didn't go anywhere, just stood, arms loose, faces carrying the particular blankness of people processing something they didn't have a category for. A woman from the extraction crew sat down on a cable spool with her helmet in her hands, turning it slowly. People passed her without stopping, eyes averted, each of them careful not to reach for anyone else. I walked past them toward my quarters. Mint's interface was still active on the desk terminal, the blue interaction field hanging in the air above the audit template. The template was blank. The cursor blinked in the first field. Primary site designation. Below it, the cascade of drop-down menus and free text fields that would determine what happened to CERN and everyone on it. Causation classification, risk rating, workforce status, environmental assessment, recommended action. I sat down. The chair creaked. The desk had my palm prints in the grit from earlier. Mint, what is the current courier window? The next FTL courier passes CERN orbital range in 13 hours and 42 minutes. Your assessment must be transmitted before the courier exits relay distance. A late submission triggers an automatic flag in the Bureau of Resource Standards and may result in a secondary assessment team being dispatched. 13 hours. After that, the decision would be taken out of my hands entirely, and a second team would come here and see the obelisks with fresh eyes and no context, and they would file the report I was trying not to file. I stared at the blank template. The fields stared back. After a while, I got up and left the quarters. I didn't have anywhere in particular to go. Sitting in that chair with that template open was becoming a physical weight. The kind that settles in the shoulders and the base of the skull and makes the walls feel closer. The spine's main corridor was quiet. The shift had changed while I was in the pit, and the night cycle was running, dimmed overheads, reduced foot traffic, the processing floor audible but muffled behind two sets of bulkhead doors. I walked south along the corridor, past the admin module, past the maintenance bays where someone had left a welding rig cooling on a bench, past the junction that led to the pit access elevators. My boots on the floor plating, the ventilation system pushing air through ducts that needed cleaning. I reached the HAB block. The HAB block was the largest single module in the spine, a 3-level structure where the mining families lived. The entrance was an open archway with a faded colony emblem painted above it, and a notice board mounted on the wall beside it, covered in shift schedules, school announcements, a handwritten sign advertising someone's repair services. Through the archway I could see a common corridor with doors on both sides, each one a family unit. I didn't go in. I stood in the corridor outside and listened. Through the walls, faint but distinct, came the sounds of people. A child talking, too muffled to make out words, just the cadence of a young voice asking something. Music from somewhere deeper in the block, tinny and small, played through a cheap speaker. The knock of cookware, a door closing, someone coughing. The ordinary, irreducible noise of 17,000 people doing what people do in the hours between shifts. Eating, talking, sleeping, being alive in a place that existed because a supply algorithm hadn't yet found a reason to let them die. One of those families was missing someone tonight. Torrin's family. His daughter. She would know by now, or she would know soon. The emergency team would have reported the incident, and the concessions notification process, whatever it was, would grind forward. Another structural collapse. Another name moved from the active roster to whatever euphemism Florence was using this time. I turned and walked back to my quarters. Mint, new query. If CERN is classified as a biohazard site under any xenological designation, what happens to ore shipments already in transit? All CERN material currently in the Imperial Freight Network would be flagged for quarantine. Shipments in transit would be diverted to the nearest secure holding facility for analysis and potential destruction. Material already delivered to manufacturing sites would trigger a recall audit at each receiving facility. Estimated scope: Surin ore has been shipped to 37 processing centers across 14 systems over the past 6 years. 37 facilities, 14 systems. 6 years of ore moving outward from this rock into the body of the Empire. And the recall audit, what does that involve? Physical inspection of all CERN origin material, spectral analysis, mass comparison against shipping manifests, and xenological screening if the originating biohazard classification indicates potential for distributed contamination. Would the screening process involve disturbing the material, cutting it, breaking it open, exposing it to heat or pressure? Standard xenological screening protocols include core sampling, thermal stress testing, and focused spectral bombardment. These procedures are designed to identify dormant biological agents within mineral substrates. Core sampling, thermal stress, focused bombardment. The cutting face in Pit 3 came back to me. The thermal lances, the rock that tightened around the lance head, the ground that shifted after a bad cut. The same kinds of intervention, applied to the same kind of stone, in 37 different facilities across 14 systems by technicians who had never heard of obelisks and didn't know what a bad cut looked like. If the substrate was present in the exported ore, dormant, carried in sealed crates across the freight network, then the recall audit wouldn't catch the problem. It would reproduce it, on 14 worlds at once. Or it might not. The ore might be inert once removed from the planetary network. The threadwork might need a critical mass, a living connection to the deeper veins, something that couldn't survive shipping. I had no data. Nobody did. The colony's one expert on the subject was slowly turning into the thing she was an expert on. And even Harry couldn't tell me whether the weight they felt from far away was the ore calling back or their own nerves dying. I was making a decision that affected 14 systems with the knowledge base of one exhausted man who had spent 2 days on one planet. I went to find Harry. The maintenance corridor near the South Pit access was a narrow, pipelined passage between the main spine and the secondary equipment bays. Harry was sitting on a crate near the pressure door, left arm cradled in the right, head back against the wall. The discoloration had reached the shoulder and was visible above the collar, a dark tide creeping up the side of the neck. The skin there had the same glassy density I'd seen in the pit walls, smooth, hard, faintly luminous in the corridor's low light. Harry looked up when I came around the corner. The motion was stiff on the left side, the neck turning as a single unit rather than in the fluid articulation of healthy joints. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me what you actually experience, not what the medic's diagnosis says. The medic says it's nerve damage and trace mineral absorption. I've heard it. Harry shifted on the crate, favoring the right side. Ask. The pressure you feel from the rock, the heaviness. Is it only local? Only from below, from the veins under this colony? A pause. Harry looked at the discolored hand, turned it over slowly, the fingers curling with the quality of something that was losing its finer motor control. Mostly from below. The deep veins, the ones we never reached. That's where the weight comes from. Straight down, constant, like the ground has a pulse you can only feel with the part of you that's turning into ground. The hand stopped moving. Harry stared at it, flexed the fingers one more time, and then rested it on the crate beside them. The fingers didn't quite close all the way anymore. But not only from below. There's something else. Lateral. From out. Not from any direction that makes sense inside the shaft. Like standing in one room and feeling someone lean against the wall from the other side, except the other side is far. And it's been getting stronger. Months now. Gradual but steady. Like something waking up slow. Far how? I don't know how. It's not like I have a compass for this. It just feels distant. Deep and distant and... Harry searched for the word. Gave up. Settled for the same one they always used. Heavy. But different from the below heavy. This is heavy the way something is heavy when there's a lot of it spread out thin. Spread out thin. Across 14 systems. In 37 processing centers. in 6 years of sealed shipping crates carrying ore that branched and forked and glowed. Harry, I can take you off-world on my ship. There might be medical facilities that could slow this down. Real facilities, not a colony medic with a portable scanner. Slow what down? The medic can't even name what this is. You think a core world hospital is going to do better with something that doesn't exist in their diagnostic library? Harry held up the discolored arm. The wrist joint didn't bend anymore. The forearm had the smooth, glassy density of the obelisk surfaces. Besides, I'm useful here. I can feel the thresholds. When the ground gets heavy enough that a vein is close to reactive, I know before any instrument does. The other miners listen to me. We've avoided at least 2 more incidents because I told the shift lead to pull the team back. The arm came down. If I leave, somebody else gets turned into a pillar because nobody felt it coming. Pure arithmetic. Harry had done the cost-benefit analysis with their own body and decided the numbers worked out better if they stayed. The same kind of calculation I'd spent my career making. Just more honest. I left Harry in the maintenance corridor and walked back to my quarters. The template was still blank. The cursor still blinked. 12 hours, give or take. I pulled the chair in, straightened my cuffs. Old habit, the small, controlled gesture I defaulted to when everything else was out of control. Then I started writing. Primary site designation, CERN, concession reference TK4119. Extraction status, below quota. Shortfall attributed to equipment degradation and workforce attrition, consistent with prolonged underfunding of maintenance cycles. Environmental assessment. Geological instability in the southern extraction zone. Thermal stress fractures in deep basalt, consistent with tidal heating patterns. Anomalous mineral formations observed in the affected area. I wrote the rest of the classification in language borrowed from geological survey manuals. Natural formations produced by thermal instability. Tidal lock, thermal gradient between hemispheres, documented volcanic history. Every claim technically supportable, none of it true. Workforce casualties, 8 fatalities over an 18-month period, attributed to structural collapses in under-maintained shaft infrastructure. Recommendation: mandatory engineering audit of all active shafts within 90 days. I typed each name into the casualty register. 8 names. 8 cause of death fields. Structural failure, structural failure, structural failure. For Torin, I added specific detail. Lateral tunnel collapse at the Pit 3 junction, time-stamped to the alarm I'd heard from my quarters. A good lie has texture. The more specific the false cause, the less reason anyone has to look past it. I had learned that from the assessor who had saved my family on the Agri-world years ago. He had been very specific in his lies. The Empire had believed every word, right up until they purged him for something unrelated and found the discrepancies in the audit trail. Risk rating, amber, below quota but viable with corrective investment. Recommend continued operation contingent on infrastructure upgrades funded from concession reserves. Recommended action, no escalation. Standard 90-day engineering follow-up. Next full assessment in 18 to 24 months per normal rotation. I finished the report and sat back. The whole document filled about 3 pages of the template. Every field complete. Every classification drawn from the standard taxonomy. Every sentence defensible if someone read it without context, which is how every report I'd ever filed had been read. Without context. By an algorithm that parsed keywords and matched them to response protocols and never once asked whether the man filling in the fields was telling the truth. Mint. Process the draft for submission compliance. A pause of about 2 seconds. Draft assessed. All fields complete. Classifications consistent with standard taxonomic entries. No flags for automatic escalation. Recommended action falls within assessor discretionary authority. The report is compliant for submission. Nothing was flagged. The system I had spent my career trusting to catch errors, to maintain integrity, to keep the Empire's information channels clean. It couldn't tell the difference between my honest reports and this one. The format was correct. The language was correct. The lie was grammatically and procedurally indistinguishable from the truth, because the system had never been designed to detect lies. It had been designed to detect deviations from format. I had not deviated. Transmit. Report transmitted to FTL Courier Relay. Estimated arrival at Bureau of Resource Standards 11 days. Confirmation of receipt will be routed to your vessel's communication array. The blue interaction field dimmed to standby. The template on the screen showed the report as submitted in the header. I closed the terminal. Florence was waiting in the corridor outside the admin module when I came through with my kit. She'd known somehow. Maybe she'd been watching the courier relay status. Maybe she'd just been standing in that corridor since the alarm, unable to do anything but wait for the shape of her colony's future to resolve itself into a filing status. She looked hollowed out, running on the fumes of a decision already made. That made two of us. It's filed. Standard industrial classification. No escalation. She nodded once. Her hands were at her sides, and I could see the tension in them, the particular kind of stillness that comes when the worst possibility has been deflected and the remaining possibilities are merely bad, not any kind of relief or gratitude. How long? 18 months before the next assessment, if the algorithm doesn't flag anything in the interim. 24 if the quarterly numbers improve. They'll improve. I'll make sure they improve. Keep the southern shafts throttled. Stay below whatever line the rock draws, and keep Harry close to the cruise. If anyone can feel when it's about to go wrong, it's them. Another nod. She looked like she wanted to say something else. Something about Torrin, maybe, or about the families in the Hab block, or about the particular kind of debt that exists between two people who have jointly decided to lie about something that matters. She didn't say it. What was there to say? The transaction had no clean language for gratitude, because the thing I'd done for her was also the thing that might carry a dormant planetary organism into the heart of the Empire in sealed shipping crates labelled Friable Aggregate, Grade 7, CERN Origin. Good luck, steward. Good luck, assessor. I walked to the upper docking platform, cycled through the airlock, and boarded the shuttle. The pre-flight sequence took 4 minutes. Through the cockpit glass, I could see the spine stretching south along the Terminator, its modules half buried, its lights small and yellow against the dark basalt. Somewhere in there, a girl was learning that her father was not coming home. Somewhere else, Harry was sitting in a maintenance corridor, feeling the weight of something vast and patient pressing against the walls of the world from inside and from far away. The docking clamps released. The shuttle lifted off the platform and punched through CERN's thin atmosphere on a burn that pressed me into the seat and then eased as we cleared the gravity well. From orbit, the planet was a dark sphere with a thin crescent of orange light along the Terminator, where the star's glow caught the edge of the twilight band. The frozen hemisphere was a black void. The magma side was a faint red smear. The colony was invisible, too small, too buried, too much a part of the rock it clung to. My ship was waiting at the orbital anchor point, clean, white-hulled, Imperial registry markings crisp along the prow. The only piece of pristine equipment in the system. I docked the shuttle, pressurized, and walked through to the main cabin. In the hold below my feet, stored in sealed sample crates as per standard audit protocol, were 6 kilograms of CERN ore. Every assessment required physical samples for the Bureau's material archive. I had collected them on my first day, from the grading belt on the processing floor. Dark stone, dense, glassy, threaded with pale filaments that branched and forked and reconnected in patterns that looked like something that had grown. I had not thought about the sample crates until now. Mint's navigation interface was waiting for my transit order. I entered the coordinates for the next concession on my rotation, a phosphate mine in the Cassera system, 3 weeks out by standard freight lane. The drive spun up. The stars shifted. CERN fell behind me. The report was already propagating through the Imperial Courier network, moving at faster-than-light speed toward the Bureau of Resource Standards, where an algorithm would read it and find nothing wrong and fold its contents into the planning models that allocated freight, assigned quotas, and decided which colonies lived and which ones starved. My lie would become part of the Empire's understanding of itself. A small piece of false ground in the foundation, invisible, load-bearing, and certain to shift. CERN would keep mining, keep exporting, keep walking the razor edge between the rock and the algorithm. Harry would keep losing pieces of themselves to the stone, feeling the thresholds, pulling crews back. Torrin's daughter would grow up in a colony that existed because I'd chosen a comfortable lie over an honest massacre, and I would file my next assessment, and the one after that, carrying the knowledge that the system I served could not tell the difference between my truth and my lies, which meant it never could. The ore sat in the hold. 6 kilograms, sealed and labelled, and bound for an archive shelf in the Bureau's material library, where it would rest in a climate-controlled room alongside samples from 1,000 other concession worlds. The ship carried me away from CERN, fast enough to blur the stars.